Tom Appleton, and I teach in the history department, History 450W, which is our capstone course.
Okay. Again, the W, writing intensive, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm Bill Simon from biology.
Awesome.
Katie Andrick Mansberry. I teach in the English department and women and gender studies.
Katie, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Dave May, criminal justice. I'm teaching research methods writing intensive.
Okay. All right. Well, I am Cindy Judd. I'm one of the librarians here, and I primarily serve the College of Education, so I do a lot of work with the faculty, staff, and students in the college. And I happen to feel very passionate about this topic, partly because I was a high school English teacher for 6 years, and when my 9th graders and 10th graders left my class, they knew way more than they ever wanted to know about citing sources and those kind of things. And, you know, I guess I just assumed everyone was teaching that in 9th, 10th grade, and clearly what I know now is that is totally not the case. And so most recently I did 3 years of a, not an internship, professional education fellow partnership with a librarian at Madison Southern High School. So I'd taken some time off from a high school setting, came into the college university setting, and then got to go back and partner with a media specialist in a high school and really work some with the teachers in that setting and work with the students, and I got a real eye-opener in terms of expectations, assignments, what they're being taught, what they're not being taught. And so anyway, that's sort of my background, that's where I'm coming from. I work a lot at the desk with students on their writing, which is very informal because it's definitely not part of my job, but because I am very much a teacher at heart, I love to work with students. You know, I try not to spend too much time, you know, working with their papers because that just, it could be a total time suck, but I do enjoy it, and so I'm looking forward to a conversation about this with you guys. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to look at let me go back and start this over. We're going to, I want to see kind of where you're coming from and find out what your experience is as far as dealing with plagiarism in your classes. And let me say no, I don't want to save that. We'll restart this. And if you'll just take your little clicker that I've given you, if you just point it in this general direction, don't point it at the screen or at the projectors up there, just point it toward up here because there's a little thing up here that reads it. So, all right. Oops. Sorry. Here we go. Slideshow. All right. So, approximately how many instances have you found, or give us an idea?
You mean today, or
in general?
this semester?
Just in general.
Oh.
No, in your history as a teacher. No pun intended. All right. 1, 2, 3. All right. All right. There we go. Okay. So, all right. Interesting. Wow. 2 of you had more than 10. That's a little scary. Of course, if you've been teaching a long time, maybe that's kind of realistic. All right. This is kind of an interesting one. Do you think, or do you know if you've dealt with more instances of accidental or the more willful? Do you think it's more accidental than willful? All right. Ah, so interesting. It's like an interesting mix. 3 of you saying you think it's more willful than accidental. Okay. Let's go. Oops.
Can I explain my answer on that?
Yes, yes.
I, like you, hammer plagiarism from the very get-go. And so by the time they get to writing their papers, I don't think there are very few accidental plagiarisms.
Okay.
And so I know that if I did not hammer plagiarism, I'm confident that there would be more accidental than willful.
Okay. All right, interesting. So do you think, in terms of accidental, do you think it's not so because you've explained and you've sort of, you know, explained what plagiarism is, here's how you don't write, here's how you do cite, here's how you paraphrase and all that sort of thing?
That's part of it, but I start the first day telling them that they will fail the class if they plagiarize any assignment.
Okay.
And then we're going to learn what plagiarism is, and then I tell them that at least 10 times in the first 3 weeks of the semester, so they're terrified of plagiarizing.
Hey, fear of God sometimes, right? All right, so what do you think about this? Do you think and I know there's all sorts of exceptions, but in general, you think they should be able to resubmit or not? And maybe that depends on whether it's willful or accidental, or if it's obviously willful. I don't know. What do you think? They should be able to resubmit. Okay. Oh, hardcore. No. All right. What about this? Have you had to fail anyone? Maybe it's just, it doesn't have to be a failing grade for the course. Maybe it was a failing grade on the assignment. So. All right, we got one holdout. Okay. Oh, so 4 of you, yes, you have. Interesting. Again, you hardcore people. Do you require them to do multiple drafts? Okay, so sometimes you do. The yes is great. It's great. That's one good way to sort of get a sense of their writing style. Do you think there should be one consistent policy? Now, EKU does have an academic integrity policy, but just like you all said, some of you fail them, some of you don't. Some people do give them more and more opportunities to, to resubmit or redo it. Do you think there should just be one flat, you do it or you don't? Because think about it, if students are going into Dr. Stadden's class and he is just, I understand, and, let's talk about this, go meet with a consultant, I'm going to let you resubmit. And if they go to Kimberly's class, she's like, no way, forget it. Is that fair for students in terms of expectations? I don't know. I'm neutral here. All right. Mix across the board. I like that.
Can I explain mine?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I said yes, but only, I don't necessarily think there has to be, every single person has to treat it the same way,
Yeah.
but I think there should be a policy in place in a consistent way to report plagiarism.
Okay.
Because if a student does something in my course, and I deal with it however I may, the next time they take a different course, then that instructor has no way of knowing if this is a pattern. So how do you know if it was accidental, if they've done it in 4 other classes, but just you don't have any way to look that up and find out if they've
That's interesting.
done it?
That's an interesting idea. Should that sort of go with them in some way so that future faculty members know?
It does if you report to the academic, if you report to the academic integrity officer, it does.
Right, and I have reported to academic integrity, but I am guessing most faculty members don't even know that's an option, let alone do it. And I did it for that reason, because when I was interested in if this was a pattern of this student, so will I give them a chance, or will I just say, no, you failed that assignment?
Yeah.
I wanted some place to look it up, so I read all the policies and I did all the stuff, and I did report it, and I just wondered, do other faculty even know that this option exists, or would anyone even take the time to find out? Because I am obviously more lenient and trying to be more helpful if someone, it's an accident and it's the beginning of the semester and they don't know anything yet, compared to, you just copy and paste it from the internet for a test. Hello, what were you thinking?
Without changing the font.
Right, I know, that's my favorite. You're like, really?
Oh
Come
my
on now.
gosh. Wow, boy, I bet we could all go around and tell some of those stories. If you're going to do it, at least try to be smart about it. But no, But it's interesting because the academic integrity policy does give flexibility to the professor in terms of whether you deal with it on your own or whether you do go through a more formal process. So you're right. I mean, even in that respect, even though there technically is a policy, the policy's flexible in terms of individually how you deal with it. So. All right, do you use any kind of tool like Safe Assign or Turnitin? There's lots of them out there on the web. Some of them are free, some not.
How do you change your answer? I pushed the wrong button. Can you?
I don't know, I think you,
I think if you push the right button that you want, it'll overwrite your first answer.
okay.
We tested that in one of my classes once.
All right, so most of you are using some kind of tool. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. Have any of you used the consultation services at the Knoll Studio? We sent a student there to get some assistance. Okay. All right, so good. So you guys are familiar with, you know, what the services they offer, and they are really, they're so committed and so dedicated to working with students, and I have heard nothing but positive feedback from students and faculty in terms of the help and the support that they provide in the Knoll Studio. So definitely I hope that you will consider them a great resource. So some of the things I hope we accomplish, I think it would be great if we really sort of get some ideas. I'm going to ask in a few minutes, you know, what your experiences have been. You know, we're going to talk a little bit about how do you spot plagiarism, which, again, you know, if they're the font sizes and all kinds of interesting things that make it glaringly obvious, and then there's some that maybe are a little less obvious. Strategies, and again, this is kind of strategies for tracking down the papers. That includes like safe assign, turn it in, you know, so we'll talk about a few of those. Let's find out what you all are already doing that's proving to be effective in your classroom. So we'll try to, you know, get a conversation going about that. And again, recommendations for helping them avoid it. It's always best to be proactive rather than be on the defensive once the paper is in. It's always better to kind of go from the beginning. And again, the Knoll Studio and their consultants and the role that they can play. So why do you think students plagiarize?
Procrastination.
Okay, what else? Why else do you think why do they do it?
Well, if it's early on in the semester and they've never done anything like this before and they weren't taught in high school, they probably just don't know.
I think that's a fair assessment, you know, sort of that, I don't know what this is, and they don't feel like they may not feel that they've been given enough instruction, whether they have or not.
That is, though, far away second to procrastination.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay?
So using the friend's work as a guide.
Oh, I love that. Just using it as a guide. See, I'm just getting some, yeah. Nice.
I think that it kind of relates to that, but some self-conscious fear that they don't want to be embarrassed by how they write. So
I think
just
that's huge.
pulling those other words makes them look better, you know what I mean? So some level of fear. Although some stuff students turn in, I'm like, really? I would be embarrassed to turn that in, but
And maybe that's why. Maybe what you're talking about is that, you know, they do want to be perceived, not because they're just trying to slide by necessarily, but they really do want to be perceived as smart or a good student, and for a variety of reasons. There could be pressures from lots of different places for them to do that. So, Tom, what do you think?
I think it's a combination of procrastination and ignorance.
Yeah.
From not having been taught either in high school or maybe English 101.
but they just don't remember. I mean, I teach a writing intensive course. It's a W. You have to have 102 before you come here. I know you've learned this. I know that it has been presented to you. I don't know that you've learned it.
Yeah.
And they're like, no, I've never written. Yes, you have. But
Do you think that, and this is coming from, you know, not being inside of a 102 or 095 or some of those other writing, you know, classes where they're introduced to these kinds of things, do you think that there are assumptions by faculty, especially in those freshman level courses, that students already know this? They already know how to cite sources, even if they don't know where the commas and parentheses and all that stuff go, that surely they've been taught this somewhere before they get to me.
I would have assumed, I teach the 102, and I would have assumed that.
Yeah.
And I mean, just in my ASL courses that I teach for 101, in some of their reflection papers, they have to go find information and then discuss what they found. And I
Yeah.
tell them to cite where they got it. And I mean, I'll just take like the name of a website really, because I
Yeah.
don't assume that they know technically how to cite it, but I assume they know enough to not just go copy and paste it from a web page. But
Yeah.
I've learned that I have to tell them, don't just copy and paste it from a web page.
But I know as a middle school teacher, that we spiral the same instructional objectives all through elementary school in English and grammar to a large extent. We're still teaching sentence fragments in high school,
Yeah.
but that begins in elementary school. So I wouldn't assume that plagiarism is any different than most of the other writing skills, in that they have to be scaffolded
Yeah.
all the way through grad school and dissertations.
Yeah. I just remember when I know what I did as a teacher, and again, I was teaching 9th and 10th grade, so, you know, I know they did more in different kinds of research when they got to the upper grades, but working with the kids at Madison Southern and even some of the teachers, one thing that stands out to me so clearly, I was doing like an interactive presentation and had the kids using the clickers, and I had, you know, sample things on the board, and I was asking them, is this plagiarized, is this not, those kind of things, and we talked a little bit about citing sources and that, and the teachers all loved it. I had teachers who came in who hadn't been there for the presentation, and they're like, come back and do this, we think this is great. But one boy, during one of the sessions said, you know, I don't know why you're showing us this. It's not like we're going to get to use it here. It's not like we're going to use it here. We don't do that kind of thing, right? We don't do that kind of thing in our classes. Now, granted, that could just be his, you know, well, we're not doing it. Oh, wait, there was that one, you know, that could be his misinterpretation of the instruction that he's getting. But I thought it was very telling that he just really felt there was no use for talking about paraphrasing and talking about quoting and using quotation marks and giving credit. And even if you paraphrase, if you got that idea from somewhere else, even though those are your words, that idea came from another source, and you need to give them credit. They had no clue, and he saw, you know, obviously one student's opinion, but it was just very telling to me. And I wonder how much, because they do a lot of narrative writing in high school, and I'm sure there's probably been some changes in terms of requirements, but because of all the narrative writing they're doing, and oftentimes the sources they're required to just go get a source. Don't get an article, they're not even told to get a type of source, just go get a source. And, you know, who knows what they do with it after that.
My son's in 7th grade right now in Madison County Public Schools. Last semester, he was doing a project for like a social studies class. And so I make him give everything to me before he turns it in. And so he gave it to me, and he cited the website. I said, this is plagiarism. If you were in my course, you'd fail. And he says, what do you mean? I said, this is not your writing. You cut and pasted this from a website. He said, how do you know that? And I said, because I know you're writing, this is not you.
Mm-hmm.
You go back and redo it. And so we spent an hour and a half, and he said, this is not fair, Dad. Nobody else has to do this. I watched them.
Mm-hmm.
They cut and paste from the website, and they
Yep.
turned it in.
Yep.
And they make A's. And so it's not just that isolated kid's case. It's
I think it's probably very common, and I know, of course, you know, my kids are the children of not only an English teacher but a librarian, and so I have a 9-year-old and 2 11-year-olds, and since my kids have been in school, you know, they had the assignment of going and finding information about an animal or whatever, and, you know, the first, they just go straight to Google. They type it in, and, you know, here's me, I'm trying to show them, go through KYVL and look at the little animal encyclopedias and those kinds of things. But the fact is that some of the teachers are not even aware of sources like KYVL and the things that the state pays for. So they never refer students to those. They never touch anything like that. And forget the whole scholarly thing. I mean, just send them to something that's not a straight Google source. You know, find something different. But that's just, they're so unfamiliar. So yeah, my kids get driven nuts because I always try to go through some of those things. And I say, make sure you write down the site where you got that, because, you know, that's giving credit to where you got it. And of course, it's not in any particular format, but it's a start. It's a way to get them familiar with, that wasn't my idea. I got that from someplace else. So you all alluded to some of the experiences you've had. Do you don't feel like it's willful? I mean, you feel like it's more willful, especially because you sort of hammer it home. What about the rest of you? What kinds of plagiarism are you seeing in your students' work?
Well, I taught the orientation, the 3-credit-hour orientation course one semester, and we had talked about plagiarism earlier in the semester, and near the end of the semester, one of the core assignments common to the courses was to write an article review about a specific article that we gave them, or read this article and reflect on it or something. And the student used very clearly information from that article, like the number of people who did something, I don't remember what the article was about, but not direct quotes, but essentially taking the information from the article, and never ever in the whole reflection said where that information was from, or that it wasn't their own information. Even though it was about a specific article, you still have to say what you read that made you write that, because whoever, if you gave this to someone next semester, they wouldn't know what you wrote. So that kind of thing, copy and pasting for a test.
Yeah.
Like, really, for a test? Come on. You've got this information in your notes at least.
A double send.
It sure makes it easy to prove it though, doesn't it? Which can be a tricky situation sometimes.
Yep. What about you, Tom?
I have never found plagiarism in a senior level class.
Okay.
It's always in the survey classes, and I have them just kind of to get them to do writing. I'll give them about 30 movies with the historical basis to it. Mississippi Burning, Apocalypse Now, whatever, and I will ask them just to watch the movie and then react. It's just a mere reaction paper, and I tell them there's no need to consult any other source. I want to know what you think about it. Do not look on the internet or anything. And inevitably, I'll be reading something, and it is copied and pasted from Wikipedia or movie reviews or whatever.
Yeah, IMDb, right? Even has the little IMDb logo on it when they paste it.
And that's the most frustrating, because I make it a point to explain this on 2 different occasions in case anybody's been absent, so that they've all heard it. And I'll say you'll get an F on the assignment if I detect any of this, and it always happens.
What about you?
The most egregious case I had was one student emailed her paper to another student because she couldn't get to school, and to have the intention he would print it out. He took her paper, changed a few words, and signed his name to it, and I handed in both of them, hoping I wouldn't catch it. So.
Oh my gosh. Wow, like here they are together and everything.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, unfortunately, the way they came through in the stack, they were on a few papers apart, and I was like, oh, hey, I read this before.
Oh my gosh. Wow, and that poor girl. She's just like, I just need to
Because I had to
turn
send
my
them the
paper.
note, email your poor girl. She said, like, what do you say? I found problems with your paper, and this is in violation of the academic integrity policy.
Oh my gosh. Katie, what about you?
I only had one. I've only had one.
Okay.
And it was a one-on-one student who didn't show up to class enough, especially during peer workshops. I do that a lot.
Oh yeah.
So we catch it early,
Mm-hmm.
and I have them look at each other's papers and say, okay, is there plagiarism? Look for these things.
Yeah.
So the only time I had to fail, I did fail the student. Would have failed anyway because he hadn't been in class, but I failed his paper because it was blatant Google copy paste.
Wow.
Yeah.
Any more interesting tales?
I was interested to hear Tom say that he'd never had a senior plagiarize, because I've caught graduate students plagiarizing,
Yeah.
and that really pisses me off.
Well,
There was a graduate student in the doctoral program here that failed a class for
Sure.
plagiarism.
come on. Not at that level, people, come
But
on.
they failed, at least the teacher failed them. I mean, like, if you're gonna fail somebody, they should have been failed sometime else along the way, but if not yet, do it now.
Yeah. And when I had instances, of course, when I taught high school, but when I taught a class at Berea College, it was like a 101, 102 type class. And I had 11 students, and out of the 11 students, I had 2 who did basically the same type of plagiarism. And when I sat down with them, basically one of them copied and pasted huge, like the whole, one long page length paragraph. There's no paragraphs, it's just one, and it took up the whole page. And at the very end, there was this very vague citation. And the next page, again, this time it was a half a page paragraph, and at the very end, there was a citation. And so that was one example. The other student, she had been a little more crafty and in dropping little quotes here and there throughout. And then she had again, a very poorly put together citation, reference list at the end of her paper. But neither of them understood. The one boy said, but I cited my source. Isn't that what I'm supposed to do? I'm giving credit, and had genuinely, and I guess they can always fool you, but genuinely, when I was sitting and talking with this guy, he really didn't get it. He did not understand why, if he put, again, this very not well done citation at the end, he didn't understand why that was wrong because he was giving credit. And the girl, she was a little more tricky because she had deliberately put things, scattered them, sprinkled them throughout the paper. But she did have a reference list at the end, and again, she thought, well, I did show you the sources, I gave you the sources that I did, what's wrong with that? And so I sent both of them to our writing center and said, you need to take this there. I want to see documentation, I want to know, have some sense of what you talked about, what it was about, and then I want another paper. So I docked them points, but I actually let them turn it in because I genuinely don't believe they had any understanding. Now, granted, I think there's this baseline understanding that all plagiarism is, or if we give them some credit, plagiarism is quoting something and not giving credit. There's this whole idea of paraphrasing and all of that. Again, if I put it in my own words, isn't it mine? And they don't understand. No, that idea actually originally came from this person over here who spent a long time putting together their article or their book, and you need to give them credit for that, So, interesting. All right, so we've already talked a little bit about the different types, the willful or deliberate. And that's when we know, or at least it appears, that they literally are taking bits and pieces of information, whether it's a whole page or whether it's a chunk or whatever, and they're just literally turning it in, just like the boy who changed a few words, did the word shuffle game and turned it in as his own. Very obviously willful, deliberate. And so, again, here's some examples, somebody taking, buying a paper from the internet, and I guess I'm pretty naive. I think they already are so broke, how can they afford to pay for some of the papers they pay for? But did you guys read that article that was in the Chronicle? It's been a while back, where the guy who was anonymous is one of the writers for the paper mills. Did you guys see that? He has written doctoral dissertations. He has written, freshman papers, graduate papers, and he did talk about dissertations that he's written. And, it sparked a lot of outrage because, first of all, the fact that people thought he was kind of bragging about it. But his point was, I want you all to be aware of what's happening because I can write drafts, I can do this. He talked about all the different things he's been asked to do. You give me, and it was just so, raw, so very real that here's what they're asking me to do. And I know you're telling them to do this, but here's what they do. So he was really, some of the students, he gave examples of the students and some of the things that they, they were desperate and here's what I have to write. And I mean, very intricate, you think plagiarized proof assignments. And boy, he could do any of them for a price. And the dissertations, I mean, and these people are not experts on this topic, and they pass off dissertations. I mean, again, maybe I'm just naive, but I think, wow, that was pretty shocking to me. But that being said, I think the more sophisticated, the more different kinds of technology, and the more, I don't want to say internet savvy, but definitely at least the more experience they're getting on the internet, the things that they turn in are often totally undetectable. I mean, you can do all you can do and take all the steps, but there are just times when they send something by us and we don't know because, my gosh, it's all out there online for a price, and sometimes not even for a price. And if they're savvy enough, I mean, it amazes me the time they'll spend to format and correct somebody else's thing, and all that time, instead they could have just been doing their own work. But anyway, so again, here's some basic ones again. Please write my paper for me. Edit it for me. Translation. See all those parts in there I messed up? Could you write that a little bit better? That kind of thing. And then again, I guess I just feel really strongly that the unintentional is probably more the case than not, because I feel like as nitpicky as, you put the parenthetical citation in the paper and you credit the wrong source. Technically, that's plagiarism. I mean, it was accidental. I had very good intentions, but I gave that quote to Smith, page 142, and it actually belonged to Jones, page 63 or whatever. That's plagiarism. Accidental, totally unintentional, but technically still counts. The paraphrasing thing, the idea of summarizing and paraphrasing. Well, I spent all this time and I've written it myself and those are my ideas, right? Well, those may be your words, but technically that idea did not originate with you. You have to give credit. And the idea of sort of just switching an a and a the and an and you take that one word that's this really big word and I'm going to look up my F7 in my Microsoft Word and get the synonym for it, so you just plop that word in, I think, though, even when they're doing that, there's definitely some willful intent there, but again, I think they genuinely feel like I've done my best to try to rewrite it, and I don't have to cite it. So, yeah, the other thing that I think is interesting is technically, and this is probably something we don't talk about very much, when we ask a student to write a paper and, here's what's your problem, and then go address it, get your sources, and put your paper together, oftentimes they put so much content from an outside source in that it truly isn't their paper at all. I pulled this quote and this thing, and I basically glued them all together in a nice package, and I'm submitting it as my own. And there's really no original thought. There's really no, here is how I have, kind of analyzed and summarized. This is kind of what I've learned from those experts' sources that I've read. There's no original thought. So technically, isn't that plagiarism in itself? Yeah, I'm giving credit, but I'm still turning in this paper that is nothing but 3 sentences of me and 80 sentences of somebody else. That's really not their paper either. So that's another one where they think, well, I'm supposed to use these sources and I'm supposed to quote and I'm going to look really smart if I do all that. But bottom line is, there's nothing about them. It's not their paper. It's not their thoughts. They're just piecing together, all kinds of other works. So the person who created some of this content, I give him credit at the end, but I loved this slide that he had. These, the different types of plagiarists, the mega copier, where they're just lots and lots of copying everything. And all the people who are, again, kind of taking a chunk here and a chunk here, and they're just kind of gluing it all together like a little Lego thing. They put all the little pieces together, and here's my thing that I've created. And again, it's just everybody else's stuff, none of their own. So these are just probably very common, and maybe there are other types of plagiarists out there, but I think these are probably the most common types that are out there. And this one's interesting, the source faker. I cannot tell you how many times students come up to our desk. They've already written their paper, and all they need to do is find a book, because they're required to have one book and one article or whatever the requirement is. They've already written their paper, and they tell me this. Well, I've already written my paper, but I've got to find a source. And so they literally cite the source at the end of the paper, and they've never used it one time. No cites, no anything. I'm just going to put it in at the end. Or better yet, they cite it, but they've never really used it. And how often is that checked? Hey, it looks like here's this very legitimate book, and that sounds like a pretty good quote, which, hey, maybe it is, but, I know I got it from somewhere else. I pulled it offline, but this book sounds good, so I'm just going to say I got it from the book, even though I copied it off of something I found online. So I think that one's kind of pretty common and interesting, too. So a couple of things to do. It's always better to go in proactive. Just like you guys talked about already, when you start your class at the beginning of the year, you hammer it home. You let them know, here's what we're going to do. I'm addressing it. It's not even the elephant in the room anymore. I'm just going to call it what it is. Here's what we're going to do. And don't assume they know. You just can't assume that they know. Remind them, refresh them, introduce them to the different types of plagiarism. I know a lot of people say, well, I don't have time to do that. I've only got so much time with them. Okay, fine. Let's find a way to bring in someone from the Knoll studio, or maybe you bring in a librarian, or you bring in someone to introduce them, refresh them, let them know what those topics, what plagiarism really is. And tell them what to do. Here's how you put together a strong paper. Sources are great, but your paper should not be packed full of quotes. A quote here, a quote there, a paraphrase here, that's great. But the bottom line is, I want to see your work. So tell them what to do so that they know what the expectations are, which is kind of what you talked about. Here's what I expect right from the beginning. And tell them everywhere you can, the actual assignment, put it in Blackboard, put it on, preach it the first day of class, whatever. And again, it's nice to tell them why, besides the fact that it's cheating, why should they not plagiarize? It'd be an interesting conversation with them. If you went out and you spent all weekend, and you had to work all weekend because you're a procrastinator, but you worked all weekend and you worked your butt off and you put together this paper and you were really proud of it. And you emailed it to your friend who then put their name on it and changed a few words. How would you feel about that? Maybe some of that they just kind of blow off. But I think it's just interesting to sort of heighten their awareness about it. I mean, literally, if you work your butt off on something, you want credit for it. And so I think if you can kind of personalize it a little bit, help it to be a realistic example, then they do kind of get it. Maybe they appreciate it a little bit more than just, don't do this, the pointing finger. And model it. Whenever you are doing PowerPoints, whenever you are giving them handouts or whatever, cite things. Mention, according to so-and-so. I found this I heard this on NPR on Wednesday. Model it verbally, model it in the things that you're giving them. And then they see that you have, that you see value in it. And again, tell them right at the very beginning. Don't wait until it's happened and say, oh, back in English 102, I know you heard about this. You need to stress that it's important to you in your class as well. And you can even make this, depending on how you introduce your course, maybe you find some way to bring this into a class discussion. Or you put something online and you ask them to do something with this information and then provide a grade for it. Give them some kind of participation points. I know a lot of people give participation points for speaking up in class, and maybe there's a way for you to have a conversation, engage them, and take down some points for that. Stress. Hey, if you have to say it, look, if you don't participate, it's going to be a 0 for the day or whatever. But really get them engaged in the conversation. This last one is a little tricky because I know I've talked to some English faculty, and I know, especially for doing those writing intensive courses, you require them to do draft after draft after draft, and you already have 2 or 3 sections, and you have oodles of students, and you're trying to read all those things. And I don't even want to, I remember back in the day, reading 125 9th grade rough drafts. Oh my gosh, it was horrible. And it takes days to grade those things. And I mean, come home, you work till 10 or 11 at night, you go back the next day, you come home, on your lunch break, that 15 minutes you get to inhale your food, you're still grading those things. But find a way to make it apparent to them that you actually do read what they turn in. Because how many times, I'm sure you've heard it too, I hear that, being in the library, we hear all kinds of stuff. They're over there working at their tables, or they're coming up to the desk, checking things out right in front of you. Well, I know they don't read it anyway. Oh, she never reads it. I always get an A. Those comments about how it seems obvious to them that it's either busy work, they're not reading it, the discussion boards, all those kinds of things, or even those little surveys. Here's a little summary of a movie, or here's a summary of an article, and there's no comments, there's nothing. They don't think you're reading it. So maybe there's some way, and I don't know what that way is, but, maybe it's comments, whatever, but help them to know that you're actually looking at the assignment. Yes?
I have a question and then a suggestion.
Okay.
You mentioned that you do plagiarism workshops for the College of Ed faculty. Is that correct? I thought I heard you say something like that.
Well, in the context of any instruction I've done for them, I talk about it more in terms of giving credit to the source. I refer to it. It's not an intensive plagiarism-focused class, but I do try to refer to it when I'm talking about you know, when you're getting your sources, giving them credit, citing it correctly, those kind of things.
Have any of the librarians put together a video,
Like a
20 to 30 minutes, about plagiarism and how to avoid it and why it's important not to, that sort of thing? So to incorporate it as an outside class assignment, I can say, okay, watch this link, write a reflection, tell me how to avoid this sort of thing.
I think that is an excellent idea, and I'll tell you, when I was putting this together, all I thought of was, I just know that faculty, especially because most faculty, if not all of them, really think this is an important topic. And I just think faculty would very much appreciate it, and it's something I'm going to talk to the writing coordinator in the studio about and see what we can do. Because, I mean, you could take this module, embed it in Blackboard, then you could definitely tie some kind of assessment or, you know, participation in it. I think that's a great idea.
I've heard, I don't know if it's true or not, that during freshman orientation, they sit them down and explain about plagiarism.
Oh, really?
So I don't know if that's true.
I don't know. I'm not sure. There are sites, I think Indiana University is one of them. I think it's their English department. They have a really good interactive sort of tutorial, whatever you want to call it, module, to help students kind of compare. Here's the original. Here is a rewritten version. Is this plagiarized? You answer yes, and if you get it right, yay, and if you don't, here's why it's wrong. I think that Indiana University would be a good one to model after, but I think you're right. You know, just a short tutorial, you know, some kind of short, you know, whatever, you know, instruction session that you can embed or link to, even from YouTube or whatever. I think that's a great idea. So.
Can I insert? I do in my W have a mini lesson because I'm a hybrid instructor that's online and I don't see my students a lot face to face. So I do mini lessons online that address plagiarism, but especially paraphrasing, because I teach foundations, which are junior and senior students. And they don't really come to me with a lot of willful plagiarism. They come to me and they frequently say towards the end of the course, I've never written in this style. Research, APA, I've written fiction, I've done a prompt in a history class, but I've never really done original research where I'm to synthesize my own ideas and incorporate my, my sources and internal citations and things. So the second thing I do, and it began with week 1 assignments, is I do a reader response for their chapter readings each week in class, and I've made a Word form document for each of those chapters that standardizes how the appearance of the responses look from each student, and they print it and turn it in. But I require them to cite their sources when they use material from the textbook, and that's the first opportunity to approach citations in APA style, is week 1. So they understand very quickly that I know what I'm doing and that I care and that this is important to me. And when I establish that boundary, they tend to fall more into place and not assume that I won't read it or I'll overlook it or I don't know what I'm looking for. And it happens before we ever get into the W content of the research paper. Then I require my students, this is the last thing, as they send drafts, and we work on drafts with each other, and students love to say, I'll include the citations on the last draft. I will not look at drafts without internal citations and reference lists so that I can evaluate the quality of what they're including. So they're not allowed to wait until the final draft to format that paper. And I do take time at the beginning of the semester to teach them how to put a citation into Word so that it's an automatic citation. And I have a Word tutorial on that so that it's less cumbersome to do that as they're writing.
See, I think that kind of a tutorial, because Word does have so many really neat built-in features when you create it, and you just plunk it in. I think that kind of thing, you should share that with me, and then maybe I can
and you know, it's
share
not
that
perfect. Those of you that know Word know the APA citation is not ideal. It's not 100% correct. But
it's a good start.
It's a great start, and I would rather have a Word formatted APA citation than none at all. All right, so at least I can track it with that sort of citation.
Yeah.
So I don't tend to take points off if I can, you could tell that that's auto-formatted
Mhm.
at the reference page, and I won't remove points for doing it in that manner.
And databases, there's almost no database that doesn't provide that cite feature. The tricky thing is, I have yet to find one that's 100% correct. And I always, in my instruction sessions, give the little disclaimer, when you're in any EBSCO database, and there's a long list of EBSCO host databases. Academic Search Premier, there's criminology ones, there's MLA Bibliography, I think is one. There's lots of different ones. They have that little nice cite feature. Well, I'm most familiar with APA, and the problem with the EBSCO host databases is they don't list the article title in sentence form, which of course is what APA requires. So, and I'm sure there's probably something quirky with MLA and maybe even some of the others as well. But I always tell them it's a good place to start because they do typically put author, comma, first initial, last initial. Sometimes they write the full name. Okay, that's not great. That's what MLA does, but not APA. But they, like you said, especially as they're getting started with, knowing how to format. And some people are definitely more sticklers than others, and that's completely their prerogative. But I always say it's a good starting point. If they've never done anything like this before, or they've seen something like this somewhere in a book or something, but they don't really have a clue, typically the order of the information is correct. What they sometimes mess up on is capitalization and then sometimes the author information. And of course, that's all electronic plug-in, it's a little formula that they use behind the scenes, but it's still a good starting point. So, all right.
I have one other comment.
Yes.
Real quick. How to let the students know you read it without making it time consuming on your part.
Yeah.
What I do or sometimes I do this, usually I just write, but the first day of class with their syllabus, I give them an acronyms for my comments in writing.
Yes.
And that way I can either use a check, a plus, a minus, a WC, an indentation,
Yeah.
20 or 25 symbols, where I can just do that as I'm reading the paper.
Yeah.
They know I've read it, and it doesn't take nearly as much time as writing out those sorts of things.
And that was actually one of the suggestions that this guy from Rutgers had too. He said, make a key, F for fragment or whatever. You use the little codes. If it's too long, you have some kind of little code or whatever for it being too long, or whatever your things are that you're critiquing. You make yourself a little key and you tell the students at the very beginning. You'll see these kinds of things, here's what to expect, and so from here on out, when you get your response paper back, if you see a RU for run on or F for fragment or whatever you're evaluating, you'll know what it's about. And you're right, it's very time saving on your part as the instructor, the reviewer, but the students do get the sense that, hey, they are actually taking the time to look at what I've submitted.
And I'll put one little plug in for that, and I know lots of faculty don't think about this, and I'm not accusing anybody in the room, I've never read your handwriting. But feedback has to be legible, and students won't ask you to explain what they won't read because they're embarrassed to tell you that they can't read your handwriting.
Yeah.
So they'll either figure it out on their own or with a friend, or you'll never know. And if they can't read it, they can't implement change.
One thing that I started doing is I have a way I do a larger paper in my micro class, and I have them write in groups. And so in order to make sure they talk to me about it, what I do is I send them 2 grades. There's a grade you get if you talk to me, and there's a grade you get if you don't talk to me. And they'll talk to me.
Yeah. I have points like that built in for consultation. I accept a Null Studio consultation sheet as a substitute for one of the required consultations with me. That's so helpful for time for me. The Null does a great job on those early drafts
Yes.
to save me time with 40 or 50 students in writing intensive. And they take out a lot of the easy stuff so that I can focus on the more difficult tasks like voice and theme and things with them. So it's a process. If anybody wants into my Blackboard site, just let me know, and you would have access to all those modules and online stuff. And I certainly don't care if you load those. We're working from TCAC's perspective on loading a lot of this stuff to the TCAC website that you can download or use with students. There's a whole new podcast series for students starting that you could use in your own Blackboard courses that we're developing. And I invite you all to share material that you might have developed too and are willing to open source to the campus.
Yeah, I think that would be really great too, because people have such great ideas, and you're doing such creative, practical, effective, you're using these strategies, and yeah, let's share it out. Let's not reinvent the wheel.
And believe it or not, foundations course with junior students, I have to start with what is a thesis statement. That's where I start. What is a thesis statement? They haven't developed one on their own where someone is giving them a topic and said, write a research paper about a topic that interests you. I'm not prompting them. The field of play is literacy. It's very broad, and they haven't had enough practice at some of these things. So assumptions that they know how to do this, they don't.
Assume anything.
They don't.
It's true. I was talking with a faculty member in the doctoral department earlier today. She teaches masters, and I know she's taught in the past in the doctoral department. And she was saying the exact same thing. When she has students at the graduate level who are coming, and they have no idea, thesis statement, organizing. I remember, this is kind of silly, but I remember from my high school English teacher, and even the things I taught my students, the hourglass. Right? You start broad, you have your intro, you have your 3 body paragraphs, and then your conclusion, and you broaden back out. It seems very simplistic, but it's a great starting point in terms of helping them figure out how to organize your content, because some of them have no idea. And I mean, graduate students, it's not just undergrads, it's graduate students too. And of course, it depends on what they've been required to do throughout their educational career, but I think you should never assume anything. You could always try, getting some kind of writing sample at the beginning. That's kind of a nice way to sort of gauge the temperature of, where your students are in terms of their writing at the beginning of the year. But yeah, never assume anything. Never. One of the things we talk a lot about is in our instruction, and it's one thing that I feel very strongly about, I like to hammer home, is the idea of research being a process. Students like to think if they have a topic, and we'll even give them, hey, they wrote their thesis statement or they have their research question. Every word in that research question, they try to plug into a database or they try to plug it into Google, and they think there is one source out there that's going to be their whole paper in one article. There it all is. That's my paper right here in this article. And of course, that's not the way it works, and we try to really teach them that. A lot of times they'll come in with this very broad topic. Well, I only have to write a 3 to 5 page paper on the topic of literacy. Okay, well, books and books and books have been written on narrow aspects of literacy. So you may think because there's tons of stuff out there, you get 3,000 results in your article search that, hey, this will be easy because I'm just going to look through the first 10 and pick one, because that's what they do in Google. But the idea is that you really want them to see it. Fine, go in there and type in literacy and get your several thousand results and look at the results you're getting. Sometimes you get right from the article title an idea for an aspect of literacy or an aspect of your topic. Okay, I want to look at literacy for early childhood, for this particular demographic, or in this, I want to look at this aspect of, whatever it is. So I think that goes right along with that idea of it being process, because you may go in doing your research thinking this is what I'm going to find, and then you find something very different, and that's part of it. That's part of the discovery. You make some assumptions when you go in that this is what I'm going to find, and maybe you find something very different. That's part of the research process. So we really like to hammer home the idea of a process, and that you don't get one article that's got everything you need for your paper. That's not necessarily the idea. And talk to them about why you are requiring 2 books, 2 articles. When you say to them you can't use an internet source, they don't understand what internet means. They think if they go into Academic Search Premier, that's the internet. They think if they read an ebook, that that's the internet because it's electronic. So it may sound kind of simple, but even explaining to them that I prefer that you find a site, give them some parameters. If you're going to allow them to use websites, give them parameters as far as finding out who is behind that. That whole authority, credibility, currency. Give them some tools to evaluate, but explain to them that internet doesn't equal an online database that we pay a lot of money for, or an ebook. That's not the same thing, because they don't know. They come in and say, oh, my teacher said I can't. And I'm showing them something in our online catalog. It's a link to an ebook. Oh, but my professor said I can't use that. I'm not allowed to use an internet source. And I'm like, well, it's not really an internet source. It's an electronic version of the book. Well, but they're all paranoid and afraid to try it. I can't do that. So, explain to them. Organizing their sources, that's probably one of the biggest problems. They get all these sources. They've got this stack of articles, or I've got my 2 books and my 3 articles. Now, how in the heck do I organize I highlight my points I'm going to use, and how do I keep all of that straight so I know when I actually do quote, and I'm trying to do what the professor said as far as giving credit, how do I keep it all together? So maybe giving them some organizational tips. Back in my day, in the olden days, we had the little note cards. Well, I'm not going to take them back that far, but there's some merit to having those cards. And remember, used to color code them. I know I'm so old. Used to color code your cards and, stack all of your source. Here's all of these. And I remember teaching my students that. But there are ways to organize their sources. Even, like you said, there's tools in Word. There's even ways you can use Google Docs and those kind of things to help organize. So I think if they could just sort of keep their stuff together and find really good ways to organize, they might have a much easier time. And of course, you bring them in or you partner with a librarian, and we're so happy to not just provide instruction and guidance with your students. We can be of assistance in terms of assignment creation as well. Because a lot of times students will come in with an assignment for a topic and we have very little to support that. Well, if we have communication at the beginning with you all in terms of here's some of the topics, if that student comes back to you and says, I have searched and I have found 1 thing or 2 things, here's 2 sources, and it may legitimately be that we don't have good support for that particular topic. And if it's something you think is going to be popular, maybe we need to purchase some materials to support that. But that's a good way for partnering with your librarian to help with that assignment creation.
May I interject?
Yeah.
They don't know how to do good searches, keyword searches either necessarily, because they'll come to me and say, I have this topic and I've approved it and it's a really good topic. And they'll say, but I've searched and I can find nothing. And I'll say, what keywords are you using to do your searches?
Yeah.
And ultimately they will always not be able to brainstorm the right words that would lead them to the research, and it just takes 5 minutes.
Synonyms.
Yes.
Look at your statement. What are the key terms? What are some synonyms? Because the database may not call it that. It may have this other term, and there may be 4 results using that term, and you may think, well, that's not enough. There's nothing out there. I get emails from students, and students will come up to the desk. You taught my class on blah, 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 and I'm trying to find, this is very reassuring because, I spent an hour talking about it. Clearly, I was not effective as a teacher. They'll come up and say, I have this topic, and I have looked, and I can't find anything. So I go right into Academic Search Premier. Why not? Let's start there. And I get, 600 results. And they kind of look at me like, what did you do? And I'm like, well, okay, let's just start with what you know. Always start with the terms that you know. And if you get nothing, all right, let's, kind of think about that. But it's also good, and I tell them, what are some other ways to say it? It seems maybe obvious. It's obvious to me because that's what I do. But I don't think because they can always plug something into Google and get a result. And I think they transfer that to what they're going to find in the subscription databases.
And I think they're less likely to plagiarize if they have better data and research and more sources to support the same information.
Yeah.
It is ultimately what the end game is.
Yeah. The, teaching them about citing sources, that is not often something you have time to do inside of your classroom itself. I can't stress enough the OWL at Purdue. I bet all of you have probably heard of the OWL at Purdue, the online writing lab. I have been using that since I was a teacher. I mean, it's been around a long time, and they are very good. It's not just about citing sources. It is a writing site. So they give all kinds of great strategies just for writing itself. So we always send students there in terms of, finding how to format your citations, but it also gives great information about writing in general. Of course, Knoll Studio offers lots of resources, and all you have to do is Google something like, APA style, MLA style guide or something to that effect, and there's lots of things out there. And again, having them demonstrate what they know, maybe that's that module. That's a great idea. Embed something in your Blackboard course, or find some way to hold them accountable. I put down here, mention paper mills. Some people are hesitant to do that because it's almost like maybe they didn't know about that before I talked about it. But it's one of those things, again, where, like you said, Dave, if you let them know at the beginning, I know what these things are. I know where you go to get them. You kind of put yourself on the offensive and say, I'm very familiar with all of these things. My goal is to have you understand why you're writing what you're writing. Here's ways to put together a strong paper, and we don't even have to go there. But the fact that you're sort of putting it out there lets them know that you're aware of what's going on. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but I think one of the biggest keys to preventing plagiarism is to create a good assignment. If you've been using the same assignment for the last 10 years, find ways to tweak it. Somewhere in here, and I think it's on one of the other slides, it talks about that whole older brother, older sister thing where, I had that professor 15 years ago and, they're still giving the same assignment. That happened to me when I was in grad school. I have people who are way ahead of me in terms of they graduated a long time before I did. And there was a professor who was using the exact same assignment in the management class. Exact same assignment. Same made-up fictional names for these libraries, and the exact same assignment. Nothing changed at all. And I thought, okay, not a good idea. So tweak it and find ways to make it so that, if there's a way to make it interesting to them so that they want, that they feel challenged, that they're interested in, that's, they're going to be writing things they're not interested in, that's always going to be sort of a given, but there are ways that you can build it into the actual assignment so that they are a little bit more motivated, and ways that, again, if they go in with the tools ahead of time, and again, the assignment is well done, and hopefully they won't need to plagiarize or even feel the need. And getting any kind of writing sample at the beginning of the year, get a flavor, get a taste of their writing, even at the beginning, even if it's a reflection piece, or maybe you're asking them to tell you what they anticipate in this course. What do you think is going to be the most difficult, the easiest? I don't know, just anything like that, so you get a sense of how they write. And again, this goes back to that whole idea. If you are repeating an assignment, change it up a little bit. Ask them to do things as in the assignment that does clearly require them to step outside of something that would typically be asked. So if they do go online and try to find that, it's not necessarily likely to be there. So there's all kinds of ways that you can do that, and that's what these slides are, asking them to do some kind of creative, instead of having a typical paper, maybe you pair it with something like, if they're doing group work, have them work in a Google Doc, and you get access to it, and you can see the revision history. All of that is built into Google Docs, and maybe you can even have them color code their entries, and you can see who's doing what. But the revision history is all there, so you can see the work they're doing behind the scenes. So Google Docs could be a really useful tool. And even asking them, a lot of people do presentations, here's my paper and I'm going to present it. And, again, that's kind of like this idea of this oral defense, really having them kind of talk through what they've done and having them receive questions about it even. So what happens if they get the paper? You have it in your hand. Now how do I figure out if it's actually plagiarized? Because I think it is. And hopefully you don't get to this point, but probably a lot of these are things you're already doing in terms of strategies to kind of tell whether they're actually plagiarizing or not. But again, things like the font. Maybe they go along in their Times New Roman and all of a sudden it changes drastically. They don't even change the size. Maybe it's bold printed. It looks very different than the Times New Roman that it's defaulted to, right? You know, if they have clearly left out a very obvious portion of the assignment where they don't seem to be addressing it at all, you know, maybe that could be suspect. Is it a guarantee? Of course not. Maybe they just, you know, kind of blanked out there on that part of the assignment. But that could be a sign as well. And, you know, I like this. Is the citation style, if they do give you a reference list, is it a consistent style? Now, I'm not talking about whether they forget a comma or that kind of thing, but if it does appear to be very different and you all are familiar with some of those different styles, that might be a clue as well. So those are just some potential strategies. You know, obviously going to Google, looking at a section, but not necessarily the beginning of, you know, here's my paragraph and they've maybe chunked the whole thing in there. Go to the middle of that and see if there's something in there. You know, again, putting quotation marks, doing phrase searches, and try other things besides Google. Try some of the other search engines. And, you know, definitely going in, again, on the offensive, and I don't mean that sounds very negative, but, you know, having a way that you're going to deal with this ahead of time, knowing that and communicating that to students. Again, never assume, communicate. And then even if you use Turnitin or Safe Assign or something else, that's going to detect, you know, give you some kind of report of how much of a percentage of the paper, but there's still some work that has to be done even after you submit it, because it will screen it, but it won't tell you where it came from necessarily. I don't know, some of them out there on the web might do that. I don't think Turnitin or Safe Assign does that. I think they just give you a report and they'll highlight certain, you know, passages that seem to be, you know, coming from some other source or some kind of thing. So, and we talked a little bit already about the academic integrity policy. You know, I guess I'd like to assume faculty are very familiar with that, but there are definitely, you know, parts of it that are flexible. So again, you go through the more formal process where you go through them, or you can decide to address it on your own, you know, and that's definitely up to you. So don't forget about the Knoll Studio. They are fabulous. They will give you will have a consultation sheet in hand after they've met, so you can kind of get a sense of what they've done. So it's a great method of accountability. And the librarians, we're all very willing to help. We want to be part of what you all are doing and are very willing to, you know, be part of, you know, assignment creation, instruction, consultations. If you want to send your students to us, we can do that. So, and I'm giving credit to Mr. Garwood, who said, if you use my thing, this is what I want you to do. So I actually credited it exactly as he said to do. So, any questions? Do you feel like it's valuable? I mean, is this kind of no-brainer stuff? I mean, do you feel like it's good to have